Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. That was the testimony from Ambassador Gordon Sondland yesterday as he implicated the president, the Secretary of State, the White House Chief of Staff, and the former National Security Advisor John Bolton and other top administration officials in the plot to bribe the president of Ukraine to publicly launch an investigation into Joe Biden in exchange for U.S. military aid to Ukraine that was authorized by Congress and that the president was withholding.
I followed the directions of the president. The suggestion that we were engaged in some irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. These emails show that the leadership of the State Department, the National Security Council, and the White House were all informed about the Ukraine efforts.
So, should the Intelligence Committee pursue the testimony of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and former National Security Advisor John Bolton? Multiple members of the Intelligence Committee from both parties tell NBC News that they do not anticipate any additional depositions or hearings. So, has the committee collected enough evidence for an article or articles of impeachment? For that question, we turn to Lawrence Tribe, Harvard Law professor. He's a professor of constitutional law and the co-author of To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Professor Tribe, thank you very much for joining us tonight. So, has the Intelligence Committee made a case? Have they established the evidence for an article of impeachment?
I think the answer is clearly yes. They have made it very clear in the evidence that we have heard from firsthand witnesses like Mr. Holmes, who actually heard the president's voice, and in the president's words himself in the readout from the call, that the president was engaged in bribery, extortion, the usurpation of Congress's power of the purse, an abuse of his office, a violation of his oath. These are all impeachable offenses. And then on top of that, it's very clear that the president's unprecedented erection of a stone wall in which he directs everybody connected to the White House and connected to the State Department not to testify, not to comply with subpoenas, not to do what Mr. Holmes and Dr. Hill did today, and that is not to tell the truth, not to come forward. That amounts to contempt of Congress. It's a far more sweeping and serious violation of the separation of powers than even Richard Nixon was guilty of in Article 3 of his articles of impeachment. So the evidence is all there, and there is nothing left to do but collate it, as the Judiciary Committee surely will, into articles of impeachment.
What about, especially with this concept of everybody was in the loop, what about the valuable evidence that could be obtained from the testimony of Mike Pompeo, Mick Mulvaney, John Bolton? Should the committee pursue that testimony? Hard to get because they would fight, apparently, any kind of subpoenas.
Well, the committee is certainly open to it and quite welcome to hear it. But as Joyce Vance points out, if anything that they had to say was favorable to the president, they'd be rushing to the Hill to offer that testimony. So I think Chairman Schiff is right to say that we can draw negative inferences from their refusal to show up. And the fact that Bolton would much rather earn $2 million and tell his story in a book that he's going to be selling than to the Congress and the American people says it all. The fact is that they can testify, but there's no good reason for the Intelligence Committee to hold things back while they fight subpoenas in the courts. No matter how quickly the courts move, that takes time. Whenever they rule, there will be an appeal. There's no reason to hold it up. And in fact, holding it up risks giving the president more opportunity to manipulate the 2020 election. We can't wait for that election.
And so on the assumption that the Intelligence Committee, using the evidence they've gathered so far, will write a report, send it to the Judiciary Committee. Judiciary Committee staff and members will work on that and see if they can produce an article of impeachment or two or three from that work for the Intelligence Committee. Should the Judiciary Committee also consider possible articles of impeachment that are outside of that evidence. For example, possibly obstruction of justice evidence developed in the Mueller report?
I think we'll certainly consider that, but whether that will lead to unduly protracted and prolix impeachment articles is a question of strategy and tactics that I think it's a little too early to decide about. But I think the Judiciary Committee is not going to forget about those things. And even if they don't form separate articles of impeachment, they can be folded into the context by forming part of the pattern of behavior that involves claiming to be above the law, not complying with legal obligation and legal requirements. And that pattern establishes that we are not just dealing with a one-off event. It's not just a phone call. It's not just a plot that lasted several months in this one case. It is a completely lawless presidency. I've called it an anti-presidency, and I think that it's important for that entire picture to be painted in however many or few articles of impeachment are presented by the Judiciary Committee for a vote on the House floor.
Professor Laurence Tribe, always an honor to have you join us. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much, Professor.
My pleasure.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.